All right, good morning, everybody. Today we're going to continue on with the Chapter 12 notes, just as a reminder that your media bias assignment is due tomorrow night by midnight, so please make sure that you get that to me sometime during the day tomorrow. We'll get part of the way through the notes today, through the Supreme Court cases that you need to know, and then we'll finish up Chapter 12 notes tomorrow. You'll have a quiz over Chapter 12 on Wednesday that will consist of 2 extended response questions that you'll have to answer. Thursday, Friday, and Monday of next week, we will do chapters 17, 18, and 19, and that will be all of the new material for this year. So we'll spend some time reviewing for the AP test, and then we'll finish up the year with our conspiracy theories assignment, like I always do with my Gov classes every year. So that's kind of the plan for the rest of the way through. Today we'll kind of pick up with where we left off last week. I want to talk a little bit about the structure of the media today. So most big cities today, most are just cities in general, only have one newspaper, if that. So it used to be most cities had multiple newspapers that were competing for an audience. Today, as newspaper readership has declined significantly, very few cities have multiple newspapers. It was down to 4% by 1972. Today, I would venture there may only be 1 or 2 big cities left in the United States who have multiple newspapers. Dayton Daily News was obviously struggling. They were repurchased by Cox Media this past year, which allowed them to kind of stay producing every day. They had talked about going down to 3 or 4 days a week in terms of printing. Englewood Independent has ceased operations in terms of a printed newspaper. So we've seen newspapers really start to decline significantly as people are getting their news from the internet. So printed newspapers are essentially old news. So with technology today, they don't really serve a huge purpose there. Age is obviously a big factor in that. In the 40s and 50s, those who were under 30 read the newspaper at the same rate of those who were 65 and older. Today, older people, I know my parents still read the newspaper. Younger people don't read it at all, hardly. So very few younger people read the paper. Most American-owned newspapers are local. There was actually a rule prior to 1990 that said no company could own multiple media outlets in a market, meaning if you owned a TV station, you couldn't also own a radio station, or you couldn't also own a newspaper or things like that. We've eliminated those rules. So today, for a long time, the Dayton Daily News was co-owned by the same people who owned Channel 7 and the same people who owned WHIO Radio. So that had been the case for a while. There used to be limits as well on the number of radio stations that you could own in a market. Today, those restrictions have been lifted. Clear Channel Media in Dayton, which is like Mix 107.7, 106.5, 99.9, 94.5, stations like that, they're all owned by the same company. So that's one big media conglomerate that owns a lot of things. So today, we've gotten rid of a lot of the smaller-owned markets, the smaller-owned newspapers. So locally, obviously, Cox Media is significant. That's who owns Channel 7 in that group, as well as Sinclair Broadcasting, which owns Channel 45 and 22. That's another big media conglomerate that owns a lot of things in the area. So that's the norm today. That's obviously a significant change from what we've seen in the past. So here's just kind of a graph, and obviously we know this. This is newspaper readership declining steadily among most age groups, and this was only going through 2012. So these numbers have dropped off even more precipitously since then. So I would say that these numbers, particularly among young people, are down in probably the 10 to 12%. So it's not a high percentage who read the newspaper anymore. All right. Now, we talked a little bit last time about the Associated Press, and the Associated Press allows local newspapers to cover national stories. So most local papers get their national stories from the AP or another group called the UPI. If you go on Dayton Daily News' website and you click on the World section or even the US section, Dayton Daily News doesn't have reporters stationed all over the country. So generally when it says at the tagline at the top who wrote the story, it will be Associated Press. So it will not be a person's name, because the AP publishes generally anonymously as the Associated Press, just generally posting a story. Today we only have 3 newspapers in the entire country that have over a million readers, that being the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. USA Today is probably only over that count because of hotels. Hotels buy the USA Today and give that to get a lot of hotel chains buy that to give that to guests. So that's part of the big reason there. But those newspapers, particularly the New York Times, our New York Times aren't being shipped from New York to Dayton, Ohio. They're being printed at the same place that prints the Dayton Daily News. So the Dayton Daily News printing place gets a cut of money from the New York Times to print their paper as well and to send it out. So all papers are printed locally today. And that's kind of what the way that we distribute these nationally. So USA Today is printed locally and things like that. Now, generally, these big national papers are more educated on the main headlines. So local newspapers historically, and this isn't really the case today with the internet, but local papers historically would cover stories that the big papers were covering. So it was kind of like this follow the leader mentality, that if somebody else was doing it, I'm going to follow along. That must be a big story, so I'm going to cover that too. Large TV networks, the big three of the cable news networks, so CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News. Obviously, they control a lot of the things that viewers see. With their round-the-clock news coverage. A lot of the news personalities who we see on these networks today kind of got their start covering one big story. I remember back, it was probably, 15, 20 years ago now, there was a thing in D.C., the D.C. Sniper. We had these two guys who were shooting at cars on the freeways in Washington, D.C., and they were doing it in the middle of the night. And Anderson Cooper, if you know who Anderson Cooper is for CNN, used to work the overnight shift. He was on, if you remember Channel 1 News, Channel 1, I think you guys probably watched that in middle school. Channel 1 News was a big thing when I was in school, and we used to watch it at the high school too during study hall and lunch. But Anderson Cooper was a reporter on Channel 1 when I was in school. So when he got his start on CNN, it was in the overnight shift. Nobody watched him. And he was, one night, he got tasked with covering this breaking news story of this DC sniper, and that kind of made him. So his coverage of that was really good. He carried over into the morning shifts to kind of continue his coverage of this, and that kind of made his name. Now, obviously, he comes from a very wealthy family, so he probably would have had a chance anyway in the news industry. But you see a lot of these personalities who kind of get their start in some either local market or something like that. If you know who Julie Chen is, she's the host of Big Brother on CBS. She used to host the CBS morning show. She actually got her start on Channel 2 in Dayton. So she kind of worked her way up from the Dayton market all the way up to the national market to these big time stories. Now, the media, and these are probably three key terms for this chapter. The media nationally essentially plays three roles in the big picture of the way coverage of our politics works. They play the roles of gatekeeper, scorekeeper, and watchdog. Now, what we mean by gatekeeper is that the national media decides what stories are national issues and for how long they're issues. So, obviously, when we have a bridge collapse, something like that, they're going to cover bridge safety until some other big story comes up. So all of a sudden, somebody dies of a drug overdose or something like that, and then they shift their story to covering nothing but the drug situation in America. So the media plays this role of determining what subjects we care about and for how long we care about them. And this is where we really have this media bias thing that plays in as well. So if you look at the stories that maybe Fox News covers longer than CNN, or that MSNBC covers longer than Fox News, oftentimes there's a political slant to their coverage in terms of how they're doing that. So the gatekeeper role basically says, I'm going to decide how long we're going to talk about this topic until we move on to something else. Scorekeeper is basically how these media institutions help kind of make or break the political reputations of politicians. I mentioned earlier when Jimmy Carter ran for president, nobody knew who he was. So he really courted the national press. He asked these these news networks, and back then in the 70s, it was ABC, CBS, NBC. It wasn't these 24-hour news networks. He basically asked them to follow him around and come with my campaign. I'll tell you everything you need to know, and that really helped establish him as a candidate, and they covered him favorably. So that was them kind of helping make his candidacy and show that this unknown guy that nobody had ever heard of could actually win in this race here. So that's kind of the role of scorekeeper. They can also destroy a career. The they can kind of help identify potential candidates, but they can also kind of hurt them. And that's kind of playing this idea of the watchdog. So obviously, that really started with Nixon and Watergate. The media felt that they have an obligation to let the American people know when politicians are doing something corrupt. Gary Hart, I think I mentioned in the last video, 1988, was running for president, Democratic nominee, and he was accused by the media of cheating on his wife. And he said, if you think I'm cheating on my wife, follow me around and prove it. And they did, and they did. They followed him around, and they took pictures of him cheating on his wife. So that was them kind of playing the watchdog role. And you see this a lot. Whenever somebody does something that maybe they shouldn't have done, if you pay attention in the last couple of weeks, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, that Secretary of the Navy, the acting Secretary of the Navy, who made the disparaging comments about that Navy officer who had reported that there's coronavirus on his ship. The media really ran with that story, that he said all these disparaging remarks about this really popular officer, and he had to resign as Secretary of the Navy. So that was something that the media was kind of playing that watchdog role on politicians. So gatekeeper, scorekeeper, watchdog. Those are three terms you should know in terms of the role that the national press plays as it relates to politics. Just briefly, and you probably know some of this already, there is very little government regulation on newspapers. You don't have to have a license to have a newspaper. Where there's no prior restraint. We'll talk about the Pentagon Papers case here shortly. Remember, prior restraint from the Tinker versus Des Moines case means you can't be punished for something before you do it. So if I know that a newspaper is going to publish a story that's harmful, I have to let them do it first and then sue them afterwards. You can't stop them in advance. And newspapers are really only liable under extreme circumstances. So in terms of slander or libel. So it's very hard for a newspaper to get charged with a slander or libel suit. Newspaper industry is also the least competitive. There's generally only one newspaper per city. You're it. So as long as you can sell your paper, sell ads, you can kind of stay in business. Now, radio and TV have significant government regulation. You have to have a license to operate a radio station or a TV station, and the FCC seriously and very heavily regulates both of them. So if you remember, you guys are too young to remember actually watching it, but the Janet Jackson, Justin Timberlake Super Bowl show, where he kind of ripped her shirt open, and CBS got sued for a ton of money by the FCC for airing that. So now everything is run now on like a 7-second delay, so that they have a chance to edit anything like that if anything like that were to happen, or profanity that's somebody happens to say at a certain time. The FCC really heavily regulates TV networks, and they can strip your license if you have too many violations. So TV stations are really heavily regulated. TV and radio are the most competitive, since networks have to compete for viewers. And the competition leads to oftentimes more sensationalized stories. We talked about yellow journalism back in that second period of political history, where they were kind of competing for who can have the bigger story. That's what TV stations really have to do today. And you see them often, sometimes they're wrong, trying to be the first one to jump a story, because that competition leads to higher ratings. So when they get more people to watch their stations. So TV and radio, very heavily competitive. Newspapers, definitely not competitive. Okay, let's look at a couple Supreme Court cases. There are a couple minor ones here, and then there's the new big one that we have not talked about yet that we need to know. It's one of the big 15 for the AP test. So the first big major landmark media case came back in 1931, and this is a case you do not need to know the actual case name. It was the case of Neer v. Minnesota. And basically what this said is it was the selective incorporation case for freedom of the press. So it extended freedom of the press to state governments, and said that there could be no prior restraint on newspapers. So that was the first time that they had ever really, the court had ever really ruled on a media case. That was in 1931. Obviously, 1964, we've talked about this case a lot. So this was the case of New York Times versus Sullivan. This was the case about the libel suit. So you can't win a libel suit unless you prove three things: that the statement was false, that they knew it was false and they published it anyway, and that it harmed you in some way. So that part about knowing it was false and publishing anyway, we call that actual malice. So that was the key part of New York Times v. Sullivan. And then they had a case in 1974, and this actually stemmed from something that they talked about in New York Times v. Sullivan. It was a case of the Miami Herald versus Tornillo. So the newspaper doesn't have to give someone the right to respond to a story. Now, remember back in 1964, New York Times v. Sullivan had to ask for a retraction. And they said, no, you don't have to do that. In 1974, they kind of went a step further and said they don't have to give you the chance to respond to a story either. So those are all cases that expanded freedom of the press in the United States. So we have one of the most significant in our country freedom of the press protections of any country in the world. So the press here is very heavily protected. Now, here's the case we have not talked about yet, and this is a significant case. It's one of the big 15 that you could be asked to write about on the AP test. This is the case of New York Times versus United States. Now note, people get these confused all the time. New York Times v. Sullivan was the Martin Luther King case down in Alabama, where they sued over that police chief and wanting to sue for slander. This case is different. This is New York Times versus United States. And the case issue here was, does the government's efforts to prevent newspapers from publishing classified information given to them by a leaker violate First Amendment protection of free press? Now, we learned in the last chapter, when we looked at the bureaucracy, that we have this whistleblower protection. Now, we didn't have that yet in 1971. So the leaker themselves, somebody who saw some sort of corruption in the government and leaked that information, they at this time were not necessarily protected. But were the newspapers who got the information protected under freedom of the press for publishing it? So basically what happened in 1971, the Nixon administration attempted to suppress publication of some top secret military information about Vietnam, claiming that if it was published, it would endanger national security. Now, this was some embarrassing things. Now, a lot of it happened under Lyndon Johnson. It didn't happen under the Nixon administration, but it was still things that the Nixon administration did not want to be public. Now, kind of a little bit of background, 1970, a guy by the name of Daniel Ellsberg leaked some top secret information to the New York Times. It was a document known as the Pentagon Papers. So I don't know if you covered that last year in U.S. history, but it was known as the Pentagon Papers. And it showed basically that Lyndon Johnson had lied to Congress and had lied to the American people about what the U.S. was actually doing in Southeast Asia. So in 1971, the New York Times publishes the first chapter of the Pentagon Papers. And once they have published this, the Nixon administration issues an injunction against publishing the rest of it to both the New York Times and the Washington Post, because the Washington Post was planning to publish it as well. This was not a time where we had internet, so if the New York Times had published it, nobody in the rest of the country really would have seen it. So the Washington Post was planning to publish it as well. A government argued that the publication would imperil national security, and the Supreme Court heard it in 1971. So this was right after the Warren Court. So now we're into the Burger Court, still fairly liberal. So this is the same court that gave us Roe v. Wade, cases like that. So still fairly liberal, not as liberal as the Warren Court, but still fairly liberal. Now, what the court is going to say by a 6-3 vote, and it's a little closer than what we saw under the Warren Court, is that the Nixon administration did violate the First Amendment. So the court ruled that the government had not met what they called the heavy burden of showing justification for the enforcement of prior restraint. Basically saying, you're trying to punish them for something or tell them that they can't do something before they do it. Okay, the first chapter that had been published didn't really contain anything that violated national security. So basically what they said is that you can't tell them they can't do it before they do it. Okay, so the court's going to order the immediate end of the injunctions against publication, and they had two rationales for this. Okay, first, what they said is that both the history and language of the First Amendment support the view that the press must be left free to publish news, whatever the source, without censorship, injunction, or prior restraint. So it doesn't matter how they got this information. Yes, they got it, and the guy probably shouldn't have leaked it. It was illegally leaked information, but they got it. And at that point, the First Amendment protects their publication of that. Second, the publication of a history of action in Vietnam, the court said, does not endanger current military personnel by revealing their location or movement. So might it make us look bad? Yes. Might our enemies respond based upon something that we did previously? Yes. But does it give away current troop locations or troop movements? No, because it was talking about something that had happened in 1968 and 1969, and by the time this was ruled on, it was 1971. So our troops were not in the exact same place. The military plans had obviously changed a lot in 2 years. So because of that, the court's going to rule in favor of the New York Times. So this is consistent. The same way that they ruled in the favor of the New York Times in the New York Times v. Sullivan case, they're going to be consistent here. So this was something that the court throughout our history has really protected First Amendment free press protections. That has always been something that they've done. Okay, now couple more slides here, we'll be finished. Rules governing the media today: confidentiality of sources. There are 34 states today that have laws protecting confidential sources. So they will not force a newspaper or any other media outlet to reveal where they got something. The federal government, however, and 16 other states do not have that protection. Okay, so what the court has ruled in some of these cases is that the right to protect your source does not trump the right of the government to gather evidence. So let's say I have a newspaper and I do an anonymous story from a serial killer. And he's talked to me, he's given me information, he let me interview him, and I've published this information. Now, in 34 states, I don't have to reveal to the press who I talked to. But in 16 states, I do. And the federal government would say, we want all the information from your conversation. We want to know who you talked to, how you got a hold of him, where you found him, anything like that. The Supreme Court has upheld the right of government to compel reporters for their sources in states where they so choose. So there was a case where there was a writer for the New York Times who was ordered to provide sources, and he refused, and he went to jail for 85 days. So it was something that they will throw reporters in jail for refusing to provide their sources. Some reporters say, you know what, we'll take it. We have freedom of the press, and if people won't talk to us, if we think that they're going to reveal who the source is. So we're not going to say. Now, President Trump actually tweeted about this weekend, where he basically said, if you see any story that says it's from an anonymous source, it's made up. Now, I will tell you, throughout American history, that has not been the case. There are a lot of people who work for President Trump who probably talk to the media, but they talk to the media on the condition of anonymity. You can't tell them that we're telling you this, or else we'll get fired, or whatever the case may be. So there are a lot of stories that have truth to them that are out there, and they're published as confidential stories. The police have also upheld the rights. The courts have upheld the rights of the police to even go as far as to search newspaper offices, to search your computer to see if you have emails from the person that you talk to. Congress has now changed the laws a little bit to require a subpoena. You have to basically go to a judge with evidence that this person has this information on their computer. Can I go in and search it? Things like that. But this is something where there are states that allow this. So even though we have freedom of the press, it is not completely unlimited. Sometimes you are asked to reveal your sources. Last thing here is regulation of broadcasting. We talked about licenses. The FCC grants radio licenses for 7 years and TV stations for 5 years. TV and radio must show that they have a public service mission, so you must air, whether it be children's programming on TV or community affairs programs or things like that. I mentioned last week the Clear Channel stations that on Sunday mornings do the 7 to 8 a.m. Weekly focus of things happening in the Dayton area. That's their public service mission. The government can force stations to show less violent things, and they can set guidelines for different times of day. The things that you can see on TV at 2 o'clock in the afternoon are going to be different than the things you see at 10 p.m. and are definitely going to be different than the things you see at 2 a.m. So whether it be violence, whether it be language, nudity, things like that are restricted at some points, they're not restricted at others, and the FCC enforces that. And today, radio stations can own up to 8 stations per market. So the Dayton Market Clear Channel owns the max. They own 8 radio stations, basically one in every genre. So they have a hard rock station and an R&B station, and they have an 80s station, things like that. So they're going to have one in every genre. Back in 1992, the rule was you can own 1 FM station and 1 AM station. So you had a lot more locally run radio back then. Today, there are only a handful of local DJs that even exist in the Miami Valley anymore. I know Mix 1077 has a lot of them, but most of these stations now run syndicated shows. So these national shows. If you turn on 99.9, it's going to be Ryan Seacrest during times of day. Mario Lopez has a show. All of these different syndicated things that come through that are national. So you basically record one thing someplace, you pay this person a bunch of money, and then it saves all of these local stations from having to hire DJs. Okay, so the media has changed in terms of how we show things, how we regulate. Okay. All right, that is it for today in terms of the notes. So remember, you have the media bias assignment that's due tomorrow. Your writing prompt for today, I want you to explain to me the background of the Tinker versus Des Moines case. What did the court rule and why? And then that case happened 2 years before New York Times versus United States, okay? The Pentagon Papers case that we just talked about. Talk to me how the Tinker versus Des Moines case influenced the New York Times versus U.S. case. So explain to me Tinker Des Moines, give me background, what did the court rule and why? And then link that case to New York Times versus United States. How did that case influence the other one? Hope everybody has a great day. I will talk to you tomorrow.